Story number 1. A shiver down the slope. I always used to think of Aspen, Colorado, as a glamorous winter wonderland, a place of roaring fireplaces and five-star lodges, champagne toasts under sparkling chandeliers, and perfectly groomed slopes where well-heeled tourists carved graceful arcs in fresh powder. I never imagined it could hold a darkness so deep that the wind itself would carry whispers of something beyond the grave. Until I found myself caught in the chilling shadow of a long-forgotten tragedy, I would have sworn Aspen's beauty was immune to ghosts. Now, I know better. I arrived late one December afternoon, driving a rental car along winding mountain roads dusted with snow. The sun dipped low, turning the sky an ember orange. In the distance, I could see the slopes of Aspen Mountain, bleached white and dotted with sleek gondolas. Cars with ski racks lined the roads, and well-bundled tourists ambled through town, their cheeks rosy from the cold. The holiday buzz was palpable, twinkling lights, scented pine wreaths on every lamppost. But after checking into my modest lodge, I discovered a battered old brochure in the lobby that piqued my curiosity: Lost Trails of Aspen, Myth and Folklore. I'm a travel writer, always sniffing out an offbeat angle. The brochure promised something more than the usual tourist fare: a rumored haunted slope, abandoned since the mid-1960s, hidden in a thick pine forest just outside of town. A single paragraph mentioned an accident that had claimed the lives of an entire skiing party during a sudden blizzard, never to be recovered. Since then, local legends spoke of ghostly apparitions. The line that hooked me read: on cold, moonlit nights, one might hear screams on the wind and glimpse figures gliding across the slope, only to vanish into darkness. That evening, I asked the lodge's receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Dana, about the old slope. Her face fell. "I've heard folks talk about it," she said, leaning in. "It's not in the official guides. People say a group of skiers got lost in a freak storm, around 1965. They never made it out. The rescue teams found only broken poles, half-buried gear, but no bodies, like they'd been swallowed by the mountain." She hesitated, then added, "My grandpa used to claim their spirits still roam that slope, searching for a way home." I felt the hair on my arms prickle. A story like that was catnip to my writerly instincts. I pressed for more details, location, directions. She responded with a worried frown. "There's an old logging road that leads into the forest behind a chain-link fence posted with no trespassing signs. Locals tend to steer clear. It's easy to get lost, and with winter storms," she trailed off, concern evident in her eyes. "If you go, just be careful." The next morning, I borrowed a pair of snowshoes from the lodge and set out. The forecast promised flurries, but the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Sunlight bounced off the snow, making the air look crystalline. My breath plumed in small white gusts. Following Dana's directions, I found a dirt turnout off a lesser-used highway, where a battered sign read, "Trespassing prohibited, unsafe trail." A rusted chain blocked a narrow, wooded path. My heart thumped. This was it, then, the road to the lost slope. Easing around the chain, I crunched through fresh snow, pine branches overhead filtering the sunlight into shifting patches. About a half-mile in, the trail opened onto a broader clearing. There, half buried in snowdrifts, stood an old wooden signpost with faded lettering. "Ridgemont Ski Trail. Closed." From the corner of my eye, I spotted an abandoned wooden hut, a ticket kiosk, perhaps. Its paint peeled, windows smashed. Snow piled against the door, and a tattered poster inside advertised a ski event from 1964. The image of a smiling woman in vintage ski gear felt jarring, as though time had frozen right there in that little shack. I pressed on, following a faint depression in the snow that might have been the old slope. Trees closed in around me, their branches heavy with white. The hush was immense, only the crunch of my snowshoes disturbed the silence. Oddly, I felt an undercurrent of dread, that sixth sense that something was off. I told myself it was the isolation or the knowledge of tragedy coloring my thoughts. The slope angled upward, winding between pines, the sunlight dimming as the canopy thickened. Occasionally, I saw old markers nailed to the trees, yellowing arrow signs pointing to different trails. Many were so worn they were unreadable. About an hour later, I came upon a clearing that must have been the top of the old run. The land sloped down into a steep drop. Standing at the edge, I tried to imagine it in 1965, teeming with skiers clad in bright parkas, laughing as they soared over fresh powder. Now, the place was silent. My exhalations formed tiny clouds. Then, on the breeze, I heard something, a faint whisper. Could have been wind through the branches. But it almost sounded like muffled voices. I froze, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The sky was starting to cloud over, the temperature dropping. My watch read 3 p.m. If a storm hit, I'd have to hurry back. I snapped a few photos, jotted notes, then turned to retrace my steps. A sudden shift in the wind made me stumble, an icy blast that brought an eerie moan. I looked up. Gray clouds now smothered the sun, the forest dimming by the minute. That moaning wind reminded me of an animal in pain, or perhaps some distant cry. My nerves prickled, but I forced a chuckle at my own imagination. Time to head back before the weather worsened. I made it only halfway down the path when the snowfall began, big flakes swirling around me. The wind picked up, gusting so strongly I had to brace myself against a trunk. Visibility dropped to near zero. My footprints vanished as fast as I made them. Dread clutched my chest. Aspen storms can be fierce, and I'd wandered off into the backcountry alone. I pulled out my phone to check GPS, no signal. The wind whipped around me, shrieking through the pines. Another wave of disorientation hit as the sky darkened further, almost as if twilight had already fallen. Wincing against the cold, I tried to keep my bearings, heading downhill. But the flurries thickened, turning everything into a swirling white tapestry. I found no trace of the old kiosk or the chain-link fence. Panic set in. My heart hammered, breathing ragged. That's when I heard a sudden, sharp cry behind me, so loud and human-sounding it cut through the wind like a knife. I spun, searching for the source. The swirling snow parted briefly, revealing a figure gliding among the trees, a lone skier in a retro suit, battered and torn, goggles cracked, face pale as the snow itself. I blinked, unsure if my mind was playing tricks. Then the figure vanished behind a cluster of pines. Fear and hope collided in my chest. Another human out here, or something else? Hello! I shouted, voice snatched away by the wind. I pushed forward, half stumbling in my snowshoes, calling again. Moments later, I spotted him again, coasting effortlessly over deep drifts, making turns as though on a perfect groomed run. The old-fashioned gear told me this wasn't some local out for a backcountry expedition. My heart pounded with an inexplicable terror. Help me! I yelled, though I wasn't sure who needed help more, me or him. He didn't respond. Instead, he looked back over his shoulder, and I saw his goggles were half broken, revealing a hollow eye socket. Then he soared away, disappearing into the storm. Adrenaline surged, and I gave chase. My boots and snowshoes felt clumsy compared to his glide, but I couldn't bear the idea of being alone out here in a freak blizzard. I lost sight of him quickly. The wind howled, stinging my cheeks with icy needles. Then I heard more voices, a babble of frantic yells, men and women, overlapping in the gusts. Through the spinning snow, silhouettes emerged, flickering like mirages, a group of 4 or 5 skiers, all in outdated apparel, wool caps, old-style bindings. Their faces were half hidden by scarves or missing goggles, as if the storm had ravaged them. They skittered across the slope in unnatural unison. A jolt of horror shot through me. Could these be the ghosts from the 1965 tragedy? My rational side rebelled, but the evidence was too eerie. My skin crawled. I tried to speak, asked them for directions, anything, but the words died in my throat. One of the figures turned, revealing a face so gaunt and wind-burned it looked mummified, mouth twisted in what could have been a scream or a grin. Then the group melted into the storm, leaving me alone once again. I'd never believed in ghosts. Yet here, in the swirling gloom, my confidence in the natural order unraveled. I pressed on, hard hammering, scanning for any sign of real humans or landmarks. Every direction looked the same, banks of snow, skeletal pines bent under icy weight. My thighs ached, lungs burned. The storm raged with a ferocity that felt personal, as if the mountain wanted me lost. Time lost all meaning. Perhaps an hour passed. Perhaps more. At some point, the wind lessened just enough that I heard the faintest echo of voices again. They sounded close, panicked, calling out names. Summoning the last of my courage, I trudged toward the sound. The falling snow parted like a stage curtain, revealing a small hollow among the trees. My breath caught. They were all there, half a dozen figures in tattered ski clothes from another era, hunched around something. Some had broken poles, others missing a glove or a boot. Frost clung to their hair, which hung in icy tangles around hollow cheeks. They seemed to be gathered around a body lying in the snow. The group churned in agitation, their moans blending with the wind. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. One figure glanced up, meeting my eyes. Her goggles were gone, exposing red-rimmed sockets, tears of ice on her lashes. She mouthed something, a plea, maybe? Then, slowly, she pointed to the body on the ground. With trembling steps, I drew closer, though every instinct screamed to flee. It felt like a dream, the air thick with sorrow. The body was that of a young man, face contorted in terror, covered in fresh snow. He wore an old ski jacket with a 1965 resort patch. A broken ski protruded from the drift behind him. The logic part of my brain insisted, this is impossible. These people are from a tragedy 50-plus years ago. Yet there they were, more solid than shadows, as if half alive and half decayed. The woman with the icy tears mouthed again, more insistently. I caught a single word on the wind, help. But how could I help them? Suddenly, a savage gust blasted the group. They scattered like leaves in a gale, swirling upward with the snow, dissolving into flickers of white. The body in the drift vanished too, as though it had never been there. In seconds, I stood alone, panting in the darkness. My flashlight had died, leaving only the weak, gray twilight of the storm. A spasm of pure panic seized me. If I didn't find a way out soon, I'd freeze. The temperature was dropping fast, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. My mind whirled with images of me, entombed under snow, my face forever contorted in a final scream, another ghost for the cursed slope. Summoning everything I had, I forced myself to keep moving downhill, reasoning that eventually I'd reach the highway or a creek or anything that led to safety. My vision blurred. Snow caked my eyebrows. Each step became a Herculean effort. At one point, I collapsed against a tree, exhaustion and cold hammering me. Darkness pressed in, swirling with the storm. My eyelids fluttered, so heavy. A distant scream jarred me awake. My head snapped up. The scream repeated, a man's voice, echoing off the pine trunks. A bright flash illuminated the gloom, and for a delirious moment, I thought it was lightning. Then I realized it was a searchlight. Through swirling snow, I glimpsed a figure in modern gear, orange rescue jacket, bright headlamp. Another voice shouted commands. Relief so profound it hurt. I tried to call out, but my throat was raw, producing only a ragged croak. Still, the searchlight shifted, landing on me. Two rescuers, real, living people, hurried over, coaxing me upright, wrapping me in a thermal blanket. My face felt numb, words tumbling out in disjointed sputters. Skiers, from 1965. I saw them, the slope, the rescuers exchanged looks, not sure what to say. They radioed for a snowmobile pickup. I must have passed out again because next I knew, I was inside a rescue vehicle, the heater blasting. A paramedic pressed a warm fluid container into my hands, telling me to drink. My entire body trembled uncontrollably, teeth clattering. The paramedic asked how I ended up there. I tried to explain about the old slope, the ghostly skiers. He gave me that professional compassion look, nodding but clearly uncertain whether I was delirious. I spent the night in a small medical clinic, recovering from mild hypothermia and frostbite on my toes. The next day, the local sheriff, a tall man with a soft drawl, stopped by. He wanted a statement about how I got lost. I told him the basics. I'd ventured beyond the marked trails, a freak storm hit, I saw things. He listened quietly, then sighed. That slope was closed decades ago after a tragedy, he said. We get folks poking around from time to time. Most don't see anything. A few claim they do. He paused, meeting my gaze. I'm not here to judge. Just be grateful you're alive. Despite my ordeal, my curiosity remained. I asked him if he believed the legends. He shrugged. People say on stormy nights, you can hear screams from the ridge. Some rescuers have sworn they've seen ghostly lights. Might just be illusions from swirling snow. Or not. With that, he took his leave, gently admonishing me to stay on the official runs. I left the clinic that afternoon, still shaky but determined to make sense of my experience. Could it have been hallucinations from cold and exhaustion? The detail felt too real, the tattered gear, the woman's tear-streaked face, the group's frantic moans. As if they were reliving their final moments, trapped in an endless loop of terror. Back at the lodge, Dana had heard I was found in the storm. She offered me hot tea, eyes kind with concern. "You're the second person in a decade who's claimed to see them," she said in a hushed voice. The other was a hiker in 2009. He swore he saw a group of old-time skiers. Didn't speak a full sentence for days after. She sighed. "I don't know what's out there, but something's unsettled." I debated leaving Aspen immediately, but a part of me felt I owed it to those trapped souls, if that's what they were, to at least write about them honestly. So I stayed a few more days, recuperating. My nightmares were vivid. I'd see their pale faces swirling in a blizzard, calling for help. In the dream, I'd reach out, but wind or some malevolent force would tear us apart. On my final night in Aspen, the temperature plummeted again, another storm on the horizon. I stood outside the lodge, looking at the faint glow of the distant mountains under a waxing moon. The wind carried a whisper, maybe just my imagination. A pang of sorrow tugged at my chest. I whispered back, "I'm sorry," feeling foolish. But in that moment, the wind stilled, and a hush fell that was almost reverent. Then the gust picked up again, carrying swirling snow across the road, as though the mountain exhaled. Early the next morning, I checked out, loaded my rental car, and drove away from Aspen's postcard-perfect streets. My heart was heavy, mind swirling with the memory of that ghostly slope. I knew I'd write about it, try to do justice to the tragedy. But words felt insufficient, always overshadowed by the lingering terror of that day. I still hear their screams on cold nights, especially during storms. Sometimes, I dream about that ridge, my footprints lost in the swirl, the silhouettes reaching out for me in silent desperation. I can't say for sure what they were, spirits, echoes, illusions, but something haunts that abandoned slope where the group vanished in 1965. Something that emerges under the moonlit snow, replaying the final, desperate search for rescue. Perhaps they're cursed to relive their final hours, or perhaps they can't rest until someone guides them home. Either way, if you're ever in Aspen, be careful where you ski. Not all slopes lead back to the comfort of a lodge. Some vanish into the dark heart of the mountain, where the wind howls a dirge for those who never returned. So if you find yourself alone on a deserted trail, and a blizzard sweeps in out of nowhere, pay attention to the shadows and the swirling snow. If you see skiers dressed in gear from a bygone era, or hear shrieks on the wind that sound oddly like a cry for help, turn around. Go back. Because sometimes, in those remote corners of Aspen's wilderness, the slopes belong to the dead. And they're waiting, always waiting, for one more lost soul to join them in their eternal, icy waltz. Story number 2. Death's Gate. I've spent my whole life chasing mountains. Growing up in a quiet Minnesota suburb, I always felt an unnameable longing every time winter snow drifted down. While other kids grumbled about shoveling, I cherished every flake, dreaming of steep slopes and the rush of air slicing past my ears. As soon as I was old enough, I headed west, bouncing from one ski town to the next, chasing rumors of the best powder and the gnarliest runs. Eventually, that chase brought me to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, a place both revered and feared among serious skiers. It was there, at the base of a notorious chute called Hell's Gate, that I first encountered the thing that still visits my nightmares. Jackson Hole draws a particular breed of thrill-seeker. The mountains are sharp as a wolf's teeth, the snow thick as whipped cream, and the runs can pivot from bliss to terror in a single unguarded moment. I arrived in early January, the season's prime, the slopes glimmering under a midday sun. My first impression was that Jackson had an energy different from any other resort, a raw, electric hum swirling in the frigid air. Locals all seemed lean, tanned, and slightly wild-eyed, like they danced with danger and come back craving more. I found a cheap room in a creaky lodge just off the main drag, run by a laconic old man named Rourke. He asked few questions, handed me a key, and grunted a warning about keeping my wits on the slopes. When I pressed him about local legends, his eyes flickered with something akin to caution. Most folks come here for Corbett's Couloir or the Hobacks, he said. But then there's that slope some call Hell's Gate, up beyond the out-of-bounds markers. The ranchers once called it Dead Man's Chute. Some come back from it, some don't. I brushed off his ominous tone. If it was out of bounds, that just meant unspoiled powder. I had no illusions about the danger, but something in me, maybe pride, maybe my lust for the extreme, couldn't resist. The next few days I stuck to the main runs, reacquainting myself with the tricky terrain and high altitude. By the third day, though, curiosity ate at me. I asked around, mostly in bars and coffee shops. People told me half-joking stories about Hell's Gate, but behind their laughs, I sensed a raw edge of real fear. A waitress at the Mangy Moose, hearing me mention Hell's Gate, set down my beer and leaned in. She explained that back in 1978, a local guide named Hank Bowman had been buried alive by a massive avalanche there while trying to lead a client down a secret chute. They never recovered his body. Some said the mountain hid him, refusing to yield the corpse. Others believed wolves dragged him away. Regardless, ever since that winter, skiers occasionally told of seeing a lone man in an old jacket motioning them away from danger, only to vanish when they looked back to say thanks. I got goosebumps at her story, equal parts chilling and intriguing. But in my arrogance, I shrugged it off. Ghost tales were standard fare in every old ski town. Always someone who died tragically, always rumors of spectral sightings. Yet that night, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, wide awake, imagining what it would feel like to see a figure on some hidden slope, only to blink and find empty air. The following morning, the sun rose behind a milky haze. A light snow dusted the ground, a promise of fresh powder. I loaded my skis and hopped on the tram, feeling that flutter of excitement in my stomach. Once at the top, I glided off, letting my body warm up on the standard runs. It felt glorious, like dancing with gravity. By midday, though, I couldn't resist the tug any longer. I slipped past a boundary rope, ignoring the posted warning signs, and pushed deeper into the back bowls. The wind sharpened as the terrain steepened. I traversed along a narrow ridge, the snow an untracked blanket of white. Adrenaline tingled through my veins. This must be the route that led toward Hell's Gate. Nobody else was around, and I felt the hush of an untouched wilderness. The slope suddenly fell away in a near-vertical face, rimmed by a jagged line of rock. Beneath my goggles, my eyes widened. If anything looked like it belonged in nightmares, it was this chute, a tight, twisting funnel with walls of stone. This had to be it. I paused, heart pounding. A sense of foreboding prickled my skin. The snow looked dangerously deep, and there were no tracks, no sign of another living soul. Even so, I found myself edging forward. My breath came in ragged bursts as I peered down, trying to read the lines. Then, just to my left, I noticed something move, a shape perched on a rocky outcrop. My pulse hammered. It was a man in a battered old jacket, his face partially concealed by a beanie. He lifted an arm slowly, pointing away, up the ridge. The gesture seemed urgent, as though warning me off. Before I could wave or speak, a gust of wind swirled powder around me. When the air cleared, he was gone. I stood there, stunned, scanning the slope. Nothing. If he'd skied away, I'd have heard it. If he'd fallen, I'd have seen a spray of snow. It was like he'd dissolved. My heart throbbed in my ears. Part of me insisted I'd hallucinated it, or maybe it was just a bit of swirling snow that looked like a person. But another part flashed to that story about the ghostly guide, trying to warn reckless skiers away from Hell's Gate. Shaken, I realized I had two choices: heed the warning or plow ahead. My pride stung. I'd come all this way. The slope was so tempting, an unblemished corridor of champagne powder. Against my better judgment, I dropped in. The initial rush was magnificent, steep, exhilarating, the snow spraying around my knees. But halfway down, the surface changed drastically. A layer of unstable slab cracked under my edges. My gut clenched. I tried to keep my speed in check, but the slope started shifting beneath me. Then came the roar. A fracture line shot across the chute, and a wave of snow collapsed. My skis lost contact with the ground. For a split second, I was airborne, weightless, my stomach flipping. I crashed onto my side, arms pinwheeling, and the avalanche thundered around me, engulfing me in a swirling maelstrom of white. I tumbled, choked on powder, fought in vain to keep my head up. Terror flared, a primal certainty that I was about to be buried alive. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. My body slammed to a stop against something hard. Snow piled over my legs and waist. Dazed, I realized I was partially pinned. My left ski was gone. My jacket was packed with snow, and I could barely move my arms. But I was alive, unbelievably, in a shallow gully at the chute's base. The avalanche debris formed a cone around me. My vision blurred from the adrenaline crash. I had to claw at the snow to free myself. Panic reared. Was another slide coming? That was when I saw him again. Standing a few yards away, poised on the same ridge, was the figure in the battered jacket. But how? I was near the bottom now. How could he have gotten down so fast? He stared at me for a moment. I tried calling for help, but no sound emerged from my raw throat. The figure raised his arm again, pointing, this time down the gully. I turned my head. There, half buried under fractured slabs, was a path leading out, an escape route. When I glanced back, the man was gone. I scrabbled at the snow, limbs trembling with cold and shock. Gritting my teeth, I freed my legs enough to stand. My ankle throbbed, but I could put weight on it. Summoning every ounce of will, I shuffled toward the opening. Each step was a battle against exhaustion and the hunger of the snow, which wanted to swallow me. But I kept remembering that silent gesture, as if the ghostly figure was guiding me away from certain death. Gradually, the gully widened, the debris slope slanted downward. I found a shallower patch, scrambled to the side, and collapsed under a cluster of pines, lungs burning. The avalanche's roar still echoed in my skull. For a moment, all I could do was sob with relief, tears freezing on my cheeks. In the quiet that followed, the wind carried faint echoes, like distant voices. Whether they were real or just a ringing in my ears, I couldn't say. It took nearly 2 hours to hobble back to civilization. By then, dusk was falling, and the temperature plummeted. When I finally stumbled onto a marked run, a patroller spotted me. They rushed over, alarmed at my condition, torn clothes, missing ski, face streaked with blood from a cut on my forehead. I babbled about the avalanche and the man who'd pointed me to safety. The patroller's expression turned grim. "You're lucky you weren't buried," she said, radioing for help. "But if someone else was out there, we need to check." I sat in the ski patrol hut while they organized a quick search team. I told them about the battered jacket, the silent warning. The patrollers shared glances. One older guy, maybe in his 50s, came forward. "You said an old jacket, right? Worn from the 70s? Brown with a red armband?" I nodded, pulse pounding. He exhaled sharply. "That's the coat Hank Bowman always wore. The guy who died in 78. He was famous for that patch on the sleeve." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold shot through me. The patroller continued, his voice hushed. "I've heard rumors of sightings. Some people claim he appears to warn them off Hell's Gate. Usually they brush it off, but you didn't." I shook my head, still half in disbelief. The team set out, but of course, they found no trace of another skier. Just the fresh avalanche debris and an unmistakable sign that I triggered it. No footprints, no ski tracks leading away. I spent the night at the local clinic, treated for minor frostbite, bruises, and a twisted ankle. Pain kept me awake, though not as much as the memory of that silent figure. Something about his presence was deeply unsettling yet also comforting. If not for him, ghost or hallucination, I'd have tried to traverse the debris field and likely been lost under tons of shifting snow. In the days that followed, word spread quietly. A handful of old-timers nodded knowingly. "Hank's still watching out for reckless fools," they'd say. Some folks scoffed, calling it wild imagination born of trauma. But the deeper I dug, the more stories I heard, skiers, mostly those who ventured too close to Hell's Gate, claiming to see a lone man pointing out safe routes or frantically waving them away from a fracture zone, only to vanish when they looked back. Some insisted it was mass hysteria, others whispered it was Hank Bowman's restless spirit, repaying a debt to the mountain by preventing more tragedies. Part of me wanted to flee Jackson Hole and never look at a slope again. Another part felt an odd kinship, as though Hank had chosen me to carry on his warning. Rourke, the lodge owner, said it best: the mountain took Hank in 1978. Maybe it never let him go. Maybe he's doomed to wander, trying to keep others from sharing his fate. I tried to write a formal article about the incident, but I kept second-guessing myself. Would anyone believe it? Even I still questioned what I'd truly seen. My battered gear, the throbbing bruise on my ribs, and the nightmares told me it was real enough. The avalanche was undeniably real, and the figure who guided me away, real or spectral, saved my life. Days rolled into weeks, my body healed, but my mind remained haunted by the slope I'd survived. I'd wake at night, dreaming of walls of snow collapsing, a faceless man beckoning me through swirling drifts. Eventually, I realized I couldn't fully leave Jackson Hole until I'd faced Hell's Gate again. It felt insane, why risk it? But part of me needed closure. So, one morning, after a fresh powder dump, I returned, this time with an avalanche beacon, better gear, and 2 local friends who knew backcountry safety. We approached the out-of-bounds area with extreme caution, testing the snowpack meticulously. My stomach was in knots, but the conditions were surprisingly stable that day. We never dropped into the exact chute. I wasn't that reckless, but we got close enough to see the aftermath, the fractured crown of the slide I triggered, the debris fan below. I half expected to glimpse the ghostly figure on the ridge. But the slopes lay empty and silent under a brilliant sun. That evening, as my friends and I sipped coffee at the lodge, I felt a tentative sense of peace. Perhaps Hank only appears when the mountain thirsts for another life. Maybe he was the last bulwark for the doomed. I'd heeded his warning too late, but at least I'd survived. Others might not be so lucky. Before leaving Jackson Hole for my next journey, I visited the small local museum. In a corner display about the region's avalanche history, I found a photo from 1977 of a group of guides. Hank Bowman stood front and center, wearing a distinct brown jacket with a red armband. His eyes looked friendly but determined. The caption mentioned he died in an avalanche the following winter. My breath caught, and I felt my skin crawl with recognition. That was the face, worn by Mountain Sun, partially obscured by a beanie, who'd warned me away from Hell's Gate. I mouthed a silent thank you, unsure if the spirit could still hear. I left Wyoming with mixed emotions. Jackson Hole, that fierce and beautiful realm, had nearly claimed me. But a man long buried beneath the snow, a man whose name I'd never known until afterwards, offered me a second chance. Was it a ghost, an echo, or just my subconscious forging a lifeline in the avalanche's chaos? Does it matter? The lines between the living and the dead blur on those towering, unforgiving slopes. Now, whenever I see headlines of another tragedy on some extreme run, I think of Hank. Some nights, in my dreams, I see him standing at the edge of an impossible drop, pointing to a safer path. I like to believe his spirit endures, unwilling to let the mountain devour more lives. And if you ever find yourself at Jackson Hole, itching to test your mettle beyond the ropes, remember Hank's story. If, on some frigid afternoon, you spot a lone figure on a ridge, beckoning or warning, pay attention. You might owe your life to a ghost who's still doing his best to save the lost from the jaws of that deadly slope called Hell's Gate. Story number 3. Phantom on the Powder. I've always believed that the mountain has a memory. The snow, the trees, the jagged trails, they soak up our laughter, our screams, our tragedies. And sometimes, on the coldest of nights, they give those memories back. I never thought I'd experience anything like that myself, not until I visited Killington, Vermont. Now, every time I look at freshly fallen snow, I remember what I saw there, what I heard in the wind, and I shiver to my core. I arrived at Killington Resort in late January, chasing the perfect eastern powder. Friends back home teased me for heading to the East Coast in search of great skiing. Everyone knows the Rockies or the Sierras get bigger dumps. But I'd heard whispers that Killington had its own allure, a character shaped by challenging trails and old New England mystique. I'd gotten a deal on a condo near Snowshed, so I decided to make a long weekend out of it. The drive up was peaceful enough, bare trees, frosted hills, quaint Vermont towns with steepled churches. The sky hung gray, threatening more snow. I remember feeling a flutter of excitement when I first glimpsed the slopes looming in the distance. Even from the highway, I could see the network of trails crisscrossing the mountain face, beckoning me. A sign by the road boasted, "Killington, the Beast of the East." I checked into a modest condo complex nestled against a pine grove. The front desk clerk, an older man named Glenn, was friendly, though I noticed an odd tension in his expression when I mentioned wanting to tackle some of the steep trails. "Be careful up there," he said, handing me my key. I laughed. "You bet. I know the East can get icy." He opened his mouth, hesitated, then replied, "Ice is one thing. But there's other stuff you might hear folks talk about. Stories. People see, well, never mind. Enjoy your stay." I should have pressed him, but I was too eager to unpack and check the trail map. The next morning, I hit the slopes right at the opening bell. Cold wind stung my cheeks as I stepped out of the lodge, skis in one hand, poles in the other. The lift lines were short. A few families and older folks chatted amiably, but it was a weekday, so the resort felt peaceful. A soft snow had fallen overnight, coating the runs in a layer of fresh, though slightly heavy, powder. I spent the day exploring trails with names like Great Northern, Superstar, and Outer Limits. My quads burned, but it was that satisfying burn that reminds you you're alive. By noon, the sky had darkened, and flurries began swirling. It looked like a storm might blow in. I didn't mind, I was used to skiing in all conditions. I took the K1 gondola up to see if I could catch a final run on a black diamond before the weather turned ugly. At the summit, I noticed a patroller checking the sky. He turned to me, expression concerned. "Storm's blowing in fast," he said. "Visibility might drop soon." "I'll just do one more run," I assured him. "I'm experienced." He steadied me for a moment. "All right. But keep to the marked trails, okay? Don't go off exploring. We get weird drifts when the wind kicks up. People get lost." We parted ways, and I dropped into a challenging slope that curved through a stand of evergreens. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. Flakes dashed against my goggles. Halfway down, the visibility indeed worsened. The air became a wall of white. I slowed, carefully picking my line between moguls, feeling my heart rate spike. I'd wanted a challenge, now I had one. That's when I saw her, the figure in the middle of the trail. I almost didn't register what I was seeing. She stood still, wearing an outdated ski jacket of a faded pastel color, maybe pink or lavender. Snow clung to her hair, her goggles askew. She looked scared. Her arms were raised slightly, palms outward, as though pleading for help. My first thought, she's a lost skier. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" The wind snatched my words. I edged closer, pushing carefully through the deepening powder. She made no move to approach me. I glimpsed her face, a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with wide, terrified eyes. My stomach lurched at the expression. I've seen fear before, but this was something else, something raw that twisted my insides. I was nearly upon her when she vanished. I mean vanished. One instant she was there, and the next, she wasn't, like a flicker in an old movie reel. Nothing but swirling snow in her place. My mind rebelled. People don't just disappear into thin air. I skidded to a stop, scanning the slope. No sign of her. No tracks leading off. No sound of skis scraping away. Nothing. A shiver crawled up my spine. For a moment, I wondered if the blowing snow had played a trick on my vision, but I felt something else, too, a bone-deep chill, more penetrating than the wind. I half expected to see her reappear behind me. Slowly, I forced myself to keep going. I had to get down before the storm worsened and my nerves gave out entirely. That night, I found it hard to sleep. My muscles ached, but my mind wouldn't settle. Over and over, I replayed that moment on the trail. Could a swirl of snow create a human-like shape? Possibly. But what about the detail I'd seen, her face, her outdated coat, the way her eyes pleaded with me? It felt so real. The next day, the storm raged. High winds, thick snowfall. Killington shut down some upper lifts. I decided to take a rest day, wandering through the resort shops, sipping coffee, and trying not to think about the figure on the slope. Around midday, I ended up in a small cafe near the base area. A few other skiers crowded inside for warmth. While waiting for my latte, I overheard two men at the next table. They were discussing a local rumor, something about a ghost on the mountain. My heart jolted. Carefully, I edged closer. They spoke in low tones, but I caught snippets. Disappeared in '84. Woman never found. Still out there when storms hit. I felt a surge of unease. Maybe I should have just sipped my coffee and kept my mouth shut. But curiosity can be a curse. I approached them, mustering my best friendly smile. "Excuse me," I couldn't help overhearing. "You mentioned something about a missing skier?" They exchanged looks. One, a heavy-set guy with a scruffy beard, shrugged. "It's an old story. People around here say a woman got lost during a freak storm in 1984 and never came back. They found no body, no gear. Just gone." The second man, younger, added, "Sometimes folks claim they see her, like a spirit. She appears in the middle of a run, looking scared or waving for help. Then vanishes." My stomach fluttered. "That's interesting," I managed. "What was her name?" They didn't recall. Maybe the name was in some newspaper archives. They mentioned the year again, 1984, a big snow year, major blizzard. I thanked them, feeling shaky. I returned to my table, the memory of that slope echoing in my head. The storm persisted another day, so I dug around online, searching Killington missing skier 1984. A few references popped up, mostly in old forum posts. One cryptic mention led me to believe her name was Lisa Becker. A local from Montpelier, she'd come to Killington with friends but separated from her group during whiteout conditions. No one ever saw her again, and search efforts were stymied by relentless snow. Some speculated she fell into a tree well or off a hidden ledge. The official stance, presumed dead. Yet rumors flourished that her spirit roamed the mountain whenever storms blew in, as if reliving her final moments, desperately seeking help. I felt a chill reading that. I'd heard ghost stories before, but rarely had they intersected with my own experiences so directly. Once the weather cleared, I returned to the slopes. A part of me was terrified I might see her again. Another part, some strange pull, almost wanted to. The morning was calm, sun glinting off fresh powder. Giddy skiers zipped about, thrilled to have new snow. I tried to enjoy the runs, but my eyes kept drifting to tree lines, open spaces, searching for that pastel jacket. On my third run, I hopped off a lift near the top of a lesser-used black diamond. The snow sparkled, beckoning. I started down. About halfway, the wind kicked up briefly. My heart constricted. Was the weather turning again? I paused under a stunted pine to adjust my goggles. That's when I sensed something, like being watched. The hair on my neck prickled. Slowly, I scanned the trail. It was empty, except for her. Farther down, near a gentle dip, I caught a glimpse of that same figure. The pastel coat, head slightly bowed. A wave of dread and pity flooded me. My rational mind screamed that it was impossible. But there she stood, translucent in the bright daylight. She lifted her face, meeting my gaze across the slope. Even from a distance, I saw tears in her eyes, eyes that spoke of despair. Then she raised a gloved hand, beckoning me. I swallowed hard, pushed off, and skied carefully toward her, fighting an urge to flee. As I got closer, she stepped backward, drifting like a shadow, leaving no track in the snow. My heart pounded. About 10 yards away, I stopped. Her lips moved, forming silent words I couldn't grasp. She lifted her arms again, as though pleading. For help? For release? I managed to whisper, "Lisa?" her expression contorted into anguish. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged, only a faint hiss, like wind through a narrow gap. In that instant, a sudden gust of wind battered me. Powder whirled up, momentarily blinding. When it cleared, she was gone, again, no trace, no footprints. The slope lay still, as if she'd never been there. I realized I was shaking. My breath came in ragged bursts. I wanted to scream or laugh or collapse. Instead, I forced my legs to move, finishing the run on autopilot. It felt like stepping out of a nightmare into the bright world of carefree vacationers. That evening, back in my condo, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to run from Killington, to drive home and pretend none of this ever happened. Another part was consumed by the question, what if she's trapped somehow? I know it sounds absurd, ghosts, spirits, curses. But the look in her eyes haunted me. She seemed so lost, so in pain. I found myself at the resort's small library corner, a nook with old articles and scrapbooks detailing local history. Sifting through them, I discovered a short piece about Lisa Becker. The article recounted how she'd grown up skiing in Vermont, was an experienced rider, and that her disappearance baffled even the most seasoned patrollers. The weather had turned savage that night, a record-breaking blizzard. The final line in the article, some folks say you can still feel Lisa's presence on the slopes, calling out for help that never came. I stared at that line for a long time, a knot in my chest. The next morning, the forecast warned of yet another snowfront rolling in by late afternoon. I told myself I'd stay on safer, more crowded runs, avoid any ghostly encounters. But around lunchtime, I overheard a rumor that a group of advanced skiers planned to explore an off-map glade. I was tempted by the promise of untouched powder. Stupid, I know, especially after what I'd seen. But I rationalized that the ghost only seemed to appear when conditions turned stormy. Right? By the time we reached the glade, the sky had darkened ominously, and wind rattled the trees. The others in the group seemed unfazed, whooping as they dove into deep snow. I hung back, a gnawing sense of doom building. Then it happened, snow started slanting sideways, cutting visibility to near zero. In minutes, the group's voices faded, scattered by the wind. I was alone again, the forest thick around me. My chest tightened with panic. I called out, but only echoes returned. The world shrank to swirling whiteness and looming trunks. Desperate, I inched forward, hoping to reconnect with the others or find a marked trail. The swirl of snow thickened. My goggles caked. Fear coiled in my gut, recalling Lisa's fate in 1984. Then, through the haze, I saw her once more. The pastel coat glowed faintly in the gloom. She stood among the trees, beckoning as she had before. But this time, I heard a faint sobbing carried on the wind, a woman's cry, heartbreakingly lonely. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would crack my ribs. Yet I didn't run. I couldn't. Maybe some part of me believed she was leading me out. She turned slowly, gliding between the pines, leaving no footprints. I followed, each step a battle through thigh-deep drifts. I worried that if I lost sight of her, I'd be doomed to wander until hypothermia claimed me. The wind's roar dulled all sense of direction. She paused occasionally, glancing back at me with sorrowful eyes, then continuing on. It felt insane, following a ghost. But the alternative was being lost in the blizzard. After what felt like hours, the trees parted, and I glimpsed a faint glow, perhaps a building's light or a distant patrol lamp. Relief flooded me. I stumbled forward, but when I turned to see if she was still there, she was gone. In her place, swirling snow eddied in a lonely dance. A wave of cold deeper than the storm itself washed over me, a sense of finality, like a door shutting. I mouthed, "Thank you," to the empty air. I pressed on toward that glow, which turned out to be a Mid-Mountain Lodge's faint exterior light. The staff inside looked shocked when I burst through the door, caked in snow. They brought me hot chocolate, called for a snowmobile pickup. I tried to explain how I'd found them, but my words came out jumbled. One older ski patroller listened with a grave expression. When I finished, he said quietly, "She led you out. You might be the first who actually followed." They took me down the mountain. My mind buzzed with exhaustion and awe. Lisa Becker, her spirit or echo or whatever it was, had guided me to safety. Why me? Maybe because I'd listened or believed. Maybe because no one else had. I spent the rest of the night awake, heart rattling in my chest. The next day, I made a decision. I asked around about where Lisa might have been heading that night in 1984. One old local, Manny, recalled that she was last seen near a certain ridge leading to a perilous drop. He believed she'd gotten turned around, ended up trapped in a bowl where avalanches sometimes occur. Manny shook his head grimly. That place is like a pit. Not surprising they never found a body. Everything funnels down into a buried ravine. It ate at me, the notion that her remains might still lie under the snow, year after year, the mountain refusing to give her back. She was searching, perhaps for a path home, for closure she never got. On my final day at Killington, I gathered courage and took a solo expedition toward that ridge, determined to see if there was any clue or marker, a cross, a plaque, something acknowledging her memory. It was reckless, but my heart said I had to go. The skies were clear, no sign of storms. I wore an avalanche beacon, told the front desk my plan, and carried a phone with a local emergency contact. Reaching the ridge was a slog. The official trails ended, so I had to traverse. But the weather stayed mercifully calm. Eventually, I came upon a narrow chute opening into a broad bowl. The snow was deep and eerily pristine. A hush blanketed the air. The place felt heavy with sorrow. I saw no plaque, no cross. Just endless white, ringed by silent pines. My breath hitched. Was this where Lisa had met her end? Did some unexpected shift of the wind bury her, cut off all chance of rescue? I stood there a long time, letting the quiet seep into my bones. Without warning, a faint breeze brushed past me, carrying a hint of whispered words. The hair on my neck stood up. I glanced around, no one in sight. But in that moment, I felt her presence. I can't explain it rationally. It was like a soft pressure on my arm, a fleeting warmth in the cold. Tears sprang to my eyes before I even knew I was crying. I murmured, "I'm sorry," into the hush. As if in response, the wind died, leaving the bowl still as a tomb. The sun glinted off the snow, dazzling. I sensed that she'd come to me in that hush, sharing a final moment. Whether it was all in my head or something more, I walked away feeling lighter, as though a weight had lifted from the air. I left Killington the following morning. The staff and patrollers never found a body. They never do. The mountain keeps its secrets, year after year. But the sightings continue, people claiming they saw a woman in an old pastel jacket, standing on a trail, desperately seeking help. Some shrug it off as a myth. Others retell their glimpses in hushed tones, goosebumps on their arms. For me, it's not a myth. I saw her. She wasn't malevolent. She was scared, lost, clinging to a memory of life. And in the end, she saved mine. Maybe by guiding me out of that storm, she found some measure of peace. Or maybe she still roams, locked in an endless search for the way home. Every so often, I dream of that slope. I see her face, the sorrow in her eyes. I hear the wind howling, feel the sting of snow on my cheeks. In the dream, I reach out, trying to pull her toward safety, but she dissolves like breath on a mirror. I wake in a sweat, heart racing. Sometimes I return to ski towns, always listening for rumors of lost souls who haunt the runs. A few folks ask me if I'm scared. The truth is, the memory does frighten me, but it also humbles me. The mountain has a memory, and it holds onto stories both joyous and tragic. If you ever find yourself at Killington, especially on a stormy night, keep an eye out on the runs. If you see a lone figure in a pastel jacket, arms raised as though pleading for help, don't just dismiss it as drifting snow. You may have stumbled upon Lisa's restless spirit, caught between life and death in the swirling white. And if she beckons you, if you see those haunted eyes, remember, sometimes a ghost can be a warning, a plea, or even a savior. The mountain remembers everything. It's up to us to listen to its stories, even the ones whispered by the wind, in the hush of a blizzard, where a missing woman from 1984 still calls out, yearning for the rescue that never came. Story number 4. The Cursed Mountain. I always believed that mountains have souls, vast, ancient souls far older than any human tradition. Maybe it's the sheer mass of them, or the way their silent peaks watch over us, indifferent to our little dramas. Either way, I never expected to see such a soul stirrer with my own eyes until I set foot in Big Sky, Montana, in the winter of my 27th year. It was there, amid jagged slopes and pristine snowfields, that I found myself entangled in a chilling legend, a curse as old as the land itself. I arrived at Big Sky Resort on a late December afternoon. The sun dipped behind Lone Mountain, casting a long purple shadow over the valley. The air tasted of pine and the faint tang of oncoming snow. All around me, postcard images came to life, chalet-style lodges with warm lights glowing in the windows, plumes of smoke curling from stone chimneys, and ski lifts strung across the slopes like ornaments. The place looked like a winter dream. Yet, from the moment I stepped out of my car, I felt an undercurrent of unease. It was nothing overt, just a tingle on my skin, a whisper through the crisp wind. I shrugged it off as travel fatigue. I'd come to Big Sky to scratch my itch for extreme skiing. Friends back in New Hampshire said Big Sky had some of the best backcountry terrain in the States, not to mention jaw-dropping vistas. I planned to stay in a cheap bunkhouse near the resort staff housing, saving my budget for lift tickets and gear. That first night, I hit the resort's main lodge bar to unwind. The place buzzed with holiday travelers, families in matching sweaters, groups of rowdy college kids, older couples sipping hot toddies. I nursed a local craft beer, eavesdropping on chatter about tomorrow's weather, a mild flurry expected, and the usual slope gossip. Then I heard something that made me perk up. Always the same damn spot, near the old boundary markers. Guy swears he saw a shadow figure barrel past him, then vanish. Yeah, his friend chimed in, my cousin works patrol here. Says weird accidents happen in that area, broken bones, concussions, people claiming they saw things. They spoke with hushed urgency, eyes darting around. Curious, I scooted closer and tried to make small talk. They clammed up, avoiding the topic. The older one just gave me a tight smile. Ask the locals, he said. They'll tell you about the mountain's old curse. That was the first time I heard the word curse uttered in Big Sky. It wouldn't be the last. The next day, I woke early, ready to chase fresh powder. The forecast promised a dusting of snow overnight, enough to soften the slopes. I boarded the swift current chair and soared over evergreen forests, glimpsing ice-laced cliffs and hidden bowls. My heart quickened. It was breathtaking, everything I'd hoped for. It wasn't until I stopped for lunch at a mid-mountain warming hut that I caught another snippet of conversation hinting at the same subject. A group of snowboarders in the corner, huddled over hot cocoa, mentioned something about an ancient monument that got knocked over decades ago. One of them, a tall woman with bright red hair, said her uncle was around back then. She claimed he saw men in suits collecting rubble from some old stone statue after an accident. Since then, she said, the mountain's never been the same. I approached them, introduced myself as a curious tourist. They were friendly enough, but once again, I got vague details, something from 1991, a group of reckless skiers who inadvertently toppled a sacred stone. People whispered it belonged to local indigenous tribes who once used the site for ceremonies. No one seemed to know the full story, but they all hinted that the land was offended, or the spirits were disturbed. And after that event, accidents piled up. Strange sightings at night. A black silhouette, or silhouettes, tearing down the slopes with impossible speed. Some called it a ghost, some a demon, some just a trick of the moonlight. No one agreed, but the unease was real. That evening, after a long day of exhilarating runs, I found myself outside the bunkhouse, staring up at the star-freckled sky. A swirl of wind carried the faint scent of wood smoke. I felt that subtle prickle again, the sense that something watched me from beyond the glow of the porch light. One of the resort staff, a wiry man named Josh, stepped out for a smoke. He noticed my expression. "You look spooked." I hesitated. "Just hearing weird rumors. Something about a cursed slope or an old monument that was destroyed." His face darkened. He took a slow drag on his cigarette, exhaled. "They ever tell you about 1991? I shook my head. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I wasn't here then, but I've heard from folks who were." A group of friends from out of state, 6 in total, were here for some hardcore skiing. They decided to duck under the ropes and ride a remote part of the mountain locals call Black Gulch. Rumor is there was an ancient stone obelisk there, erected centuries ago by local tribes to honor the mountain's guardian spirits. He flicked ash. Those idiots knocked it over. By accident or on purpose, I don't know. But that same day, an avalanche came down that slope. 3 of them died. The rest survived but left the resort, never returned. A chill crawled up my neck. That's intense. He nodded gravely. Ever since, people talk about a curse. Strange storms pop up out of nowhere. Fatal falls in places that shouldn't be that dangerous. And sightings, skiers reporting a black figure tearing down the slope at midnight, or shapes lurking in the tree line. Some folks claim it's the spirits, angry we desecrated their monument. Others say it's just superstition. But me, I don't take chances. I stay away from that area. We said goodnight, and I lay in bed, mind churning with images of a toppled obelisk, an avalanche burying skiers, and now a vengeful presence. It felt surreal, like campfire ghost stories. Yet the raw sincerity of the locals hinted there might be truth behind the legend. Days passed. I lost myself in the thrill of Big Sky's varied terrain, from the wide groomers off Ramcharger to the steeps in the bowl. Despite the beauty, a creeping sense of dread lingered in the back of my mind. I found myself scanning the slopes for glimpses of that rumored black silhouette. Once, riding the Lone Peak tram, I overheard a woman whisper to her friend that she'd found claw-like scratches on a tree near a remote run, like something trying to climb out of the snow, she said. Her friend scoffed, but I shivered. One afternoon, after a fresh snowfall, I ventured off-piste with a fellow traveler named Kevin. He'd heard rumors about the cursed area too, but he was the type who thrived on adrenaline and scorned ghost stories. All that's just a marketing ploy or local legend stuff, he insisted. We decided to check out a section of woods rumored to border the old boundary line near Black Gulch. The day was cold, overcast. Perfect for exploring untouched powder. We found a backcountry gate with a warning sign, experts only, not patrolled. Kevin smirked, leading the way. The air grew still as we glided through pines weighted with snow. It was gorgeous, silent except for the swoosh of our skis and the occasional crack of a branch. We navigated carefully to avoid tree wells. An hour in, the sky began to darken, though it was only mid-afternoon. Clouds swirled overhead, and the wind kicked up. We paused to check the map, realized we might have gone too far. The sense of isolation mounted. Then Kevin, about 10 yards ahead, abruptly stopped. He raised his pole, signaling me. I slid beside him, heart pounding. There, half buried in a drift, stood a stone chunk. It looked hewn, not natural, covered in strange carvings. Something about the markings felt old, older than the resort, older than modern memory. A stab of alarm shot through me. Was this part of that obelisk? The atmosphere felt thick, oppressive, as if the mountain itself held its breath. Kevin crouched, brushing snow off the carvings. Weird, huh? He muttered. I forced a laugh. Maybe we should keep moving. He exhaled a frosty breath. Yeah. Let's bail. Just then, we heard a whoosh, a presence racing past us. A black shape, gone in a blur. The wind died for an instant, leaving a vacuum of silence. My stomach lurched. Kevin stared wide-eyed, mouth open. Did you see that? I managed. He nodded, color drained from his face. The shape had come from nowhere, gliding through the trees with impossible speed, leaving no trace. A frigid dread settled over me. The curse. The stories were real. Something prowled these slopes, something awakened by that toppled monument. I glanced at Kevin. The adrenaline junkie looked spooked for once. We decided to head back. But the weather had other plans. A squall roared in, blowing snow sideways, dropping visibility to near zero. We tried to retrace our route, but the trees closed in, the terrain confusing. My heart hammered. In the swirl of white, I thought I glimpsed that black figure again, weaving between pines, always just out of reach. Time blurred. We found ourselves at the edge of a steep drop-off. Kevin nearly tumbled. We had to sidestep away, searching for safer ground. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling branches overhead. With each gust, I imagined the mountain's fury bearing down on us, ancient spirits outraged by our trespass. Then a distant rumble. My blood froze. Avalanche? We held our breath, scanning the slope for movement. The rumble faded, echoing across ridges. Maybe it was just a shift in the wind. Or maybe the mountain was warning us. Eventually, by sheer luck, we stumbled onto a backcountry marker that guided us toward a patrolled boundary. The storm let up slightly. Exhausted, we reached a groomed run. Ski Patrol found us, gave us an earful about venturing off alone. We said nothing of the black shape or the broken stone. I was too rattled to talk. Kevin and I parted ways silently, each lost in our own dread. That night, I lay awake, mind cycling through images of that silhouette. Every creak of the bunkhouse made me flinch. The next day, I considered leaving Big Sky altogether. But something held me back, a stubborn desire to understand. Maybe I was lured by the same impulse that drives people to watch horror movies alone at midnight. I needed answers. I asked around discreetly, looking for older locals. Eventually, I found an elderly woman, Maureen, who volunteered at a small historical center near the resort. She listened to my story with a grim expression. The tribes who inhabited these mountains had profound respect for the spirits residing here, she explained. They built stone markers to honor them. The greatest was an obelisk erected near Black Gulch. Legends say it kept the mountain's anger in check. But it was knocked down. Word is, it happened in 1991. She sighed, eyes distant. Ever since, the mountain's restless. People vanish. Others see a black phantom rushing down the slopes at night. It might be the mountain spirit itself, angry, seeking retribution. Or maybe it's the tormented souls of those who died in that avalanche. We can't be sure. A chill seeped through my veins. Could the monument be fixed? I asked, feeling childish. She gave a sad smile. Once a sacred artifact is broken, especially after being left for decades, the damage might be irreversible. The best we can do is show respect. Keep away from those cursed slopes. Pray the mountain finds peace. I left, unsettled. My rational side fought against the notion of vengeful spirits or curses. But my experiences in those shadowed woods felt real enough. My final night at Big Sky arrived. A heavy snowfall was forecast, 8 to 10 inches. Perfect conditions, ironically. I planned a last day on the main runs, no more off-piste explorations. But something gnawed at me, the chunk of stone Kevin and I found, the silent figure. My sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares of black silhouettes swarming over me, their mouths open in silent screams. Around midnight, I jolted awake to the sound of howling wind. My bunkhouse room glowed faintly from the outside lamps reflecting on fresh snow. A strange compulsion tugged at my chest. I felt drawn to the window. Outside, swirling flakes obscured everything. But just for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker, something moving swiftly across the lodge's backyard, leaving no footprints. My heart pounded. Before I knew it, I was dressed in my warm layers, stepping outside into the storm, as if in a trance. The wind whipped around me, stinging my cheeks. The resort's lights formed a halo in the swirling snow. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted it again, a black shape sliding behind a snowbank near the lower slopes. My breath caught. I should have turned back. Instead, I followed, trudging through knee-deep powder. The resort was quiet, closed for the night, lifts shut down. Yet the slope near the base was faintly illuminated by scattered security lights. I skinned up with my touring skis. Some insane impulse told me to track the figure. I half expected an avalanche of fear to crush me, but curiosity and dread mingled in my veins, propelling me forward. Higher and higher I climbed. The wind roared, but the silhouette stayed within sight, always just out of reach. It glided up the mountain as if gravity didn't apply. My lungs burned. Then, abruptly, the figure vanished behind a ridge. I reached that ridge, heart in my throat, only to find a deserted slope. A stunted pine stood to one side, heavy with snow. The hush was absolute. My skin prickled. A sense of presence loomed behind me. I spun around, nobody. My breath hung in white puffs. A harsh gust blew, clearing the swirling snow for a split second. That's when I saw it, the black figure, perched on a small rocky outcrop higher up. It seemed to stare at me, though I could discern no face, just a humanoid shape. Suddenly, it leaned forward and launched down the slope at breakneck speed, aimed straight at me. My mind screamed, but my body froze. Then, in the final instant, it veered aside, passing close enough that I felt a burst of frigid air. An unearthly moan, maybe the wind, maybe not, filled my ears. The shape disappeared into the swirling flakes below. I collapsed to my knees, adrenaline spiking so hard I nearly vomited. My eyes stung with tears of raw terror. I'd never felt so certain I was face to face with something beyond human, a manifestation of the mountain's wrath. At last, I forced myself to ski down, each turn trembling. By the time I reached the resort base, dawn's light was creeping over the peaks. I staggered back to my bunkhouse, numb with shock. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed of an ancient obelisk standing proud on a slope that glowed with eerie firelight, chanting voices echoing on the wind. I departed Big Sky that afternoon, hands shaking on the steering wheel, haunted by the memory of that black silhouette. Every nerve told me to leave, never return. In the rearview mirror, I watched the mountains recede, their snow-capped peaks slicing the sky like silent sentinels. A pang of guilt struck me. I was escaping what the locals had to endure daily. But I had no answers, no way to calm the furious spirit. Weeks later, safe at home, I still can't shake the nightmares. I wake up gasping, feeling that presence, that swirl of cold air. I read news occasionally about Big Sky. There's often a story of a freak accident, a lost skier found days later, or bizarre sightings at night. The resort keeps them quiet, not wanting to scare off tourists. But local rumors persist, the curse remains. The mountain demands respect, and those who ignore it court a dangerous fate. Sometimes I wonder if someone, someday, will find a way to restore that ancient monument. If the rightful owners of the land might perform the old ceremonies again, appeasing the restless spirits. Or maybe it's too late, and the curse is permanent, an eternal scar left by careless hands that destroyed something sacred in 1991. I write this now as a warning. If you ever go to Big Sky and hear whispers about the cursed mountain or a black silhouette racing down the slopes at midnight, don't brush it off as folklore. The locals know more than they admit. The land remembers every slight, every desecration. And when the wind howls through those pine-clad ridges, it carries with it an ancient fury, searching for the next soul who dares venture too far into the shadows. Believe me or don't, but if you find yourself alone on that hushed slope, with the snow swirling in thick curtains and the faint moan of wind echoing in your ears, listen closely. You might hear the distant roar of an avalanche that isn't on any forecast. You might feel eyes upon you, drawn from the depths of the mountain. And if you see a shape, dark as moonless midnight, carving impossible lines across the snow, heed the unspoken command to leave. Because at Big Sky, the mountain spirit awoke long ago, and it has no mercy left for trespassers on its cursed domain.